Marcus Brennan was known across the entire nation. Charismatic, blunt, and controversial. That's how people remembered him. The host of one of the most popular talk shows on American television had a razor-sharp tongue and a particular pleasure in addressing religious topics. "If God really exists, why doesn't he come right here to my studio?" he'd say to the camera with a cynical smile, provoking laughter from the audience. A few weeks ago, his show went viral due to a particularly controversial segment. During an interview with a Christian singer, he tore up a Bible live on national television, declaring, "It's just paper. No mystical force can touch me." The image spread across the internet within minutes. Some called it courage, others called it blasphemy. But Marcus loved the attention, both good and bad. Since childhood, Marcus had carried a silent resentment. He grew up watching his mother pray in vain for his father, a sick alcoholic who abandoned them. Poverty, screaming, and faith couldn't prevent the tragedy. To him, God was just a fiction created by weak people to survive the pain. And if God truly existed, he had definitely failed his family. That thought became conviction, and conviction became his program's foundation. The studio where he worked was modern and luxurious, with automated cameras and a crew that executed his every command. But on that particular day, something was different. In the hallway sat an elderly gentleman with graying hair, wet eyes, and hands folded in prayer. He caught the cameraman's attention. The man remained seated in silence, but his presence was felt. Marcus didn't notice him. The show's guest was a young missionary who spoke about miracles in remote villages. Marcus smiled and asked a question he knew would have an impact. "If God exists, why hasn't he shut me up yet? I challenge him. Let him silence me right now." An awkward silence hung over everyone. The young woman looked at him with compassion, not fear, and responded, "You're still speaking because he loves you." The room was divided. Some laughed, others were alarmed, but Marcus didn't know yet that this day would mark the end of an entire era, the end of unpunished arrogance, and the beginning of something he couldn't control. Suddenly, his throat itched. His voice disappeared for an instant. He made a noise and signaled to cut the transmission, but no one understood what he wanted. "What's wrong, Marcus? Lost your voice?" The producer joked through the headset. Marcus chuckled nervously, gasped, and took a sip of water. "I'm fine," he replied, resuming his usual tone, but inside he already felt something was wrong. The studio felt colder, the lights brighter, and the silence heavier. The gray-haired man's presence seemed to weigh on everything around him. That night, Marcus left the studio in silence. This had never happened to him before. Thoughts raced through his head, but his voice grew increasingly weak. Upon arriving home, he received an unexpected call. His mother had been taken to the hospital in critical condition. Stroke. According to the doctors, there was almost no hope. He sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time in many years, he felt a genuine emptiness, a silence that wasn't filled by applause or ratings. Nearby, on the nightstand, lay a book he often mocked, his mother's Bible. He opened it to Psalm 2:4. "He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord mocks them." He closed it abruptly, but Marcus didn't know yet that this night would be the last time he could mock with impunity. Everything that would happen next would turn upside down his understanding of faith, pride, and God. The studio was empty. Only the lights were on. The next day, Marcus returned alone, without crew, without spectators. He passed through the back door and walked slowly to the stage where everything happened. He looked at the chair where the missionary had sat, where he had mocked God, and felt a tremor. The room seemed normal, but the air was different, dense, cold. That same night, his voice failed again. Trying to record a video for subscribers, he realized he couldn't finish a single sentence without coughing. The sound was weak, shaky, as if someone was pulling it from inside. For the first time, he felt real fear, and there was no script, no producer, no operators who could edit it out. Marcus consulted doctors, MRI of the throat, neurological report, everything normal. Physically, he was absolutely healthy, but his voice was disappearing, and with it, all his pride seemed to drain away. Subscribers began to notice. "Are you okay? Why are there no more videos? Where's the Marcus we knew?" But he had no answers, no strength. In his mother's house, everything was the opposite of his modern apartment. The environment smelled only of tea and prayer candles. Mom was in a coma, connected to machines, but her face was serene. On the nightstand was a prayer book, a diary. His name appeared on many pages. "Marcus, set him free, Lord, don't let him die this way." His heart sank. It seemed those words screamed without sound. He sat there for hours just watching. He saw the crucifix above the bed and remembered how she used to say, "God will visit you, son, but maybe not the way you want." That phrase rang in his head like a sentence, and he cried, not from despair, but from the exhaustion that comes when all internal walls are collapsing. The next night, he slept at home but had a strange dream. He dreamed he was on an empty stage trying to speak, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. At the back of the hall, a child watched with shining eyes. When Marcus approached, the child simply said, "You used your voice for yourself. Now learn to listen." He woke up in a cold sweat, grabbed his phone to record the dream, but his voice wouldn't cooperate. It seemed the dream was a real message. He took his mother's Bible again, this time without anger, and opened a random page. John 9:39. "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." He swallowed hard. Marcus began to avoid leaving home, canceled filming, and made up excuses about health problems to justify himself. But the truth was he could no longer pretend. Everything inside was crumbling layer by layer. The problem wasn't in his voice, but in his soul. And who could he turn to if he had always laughed at faith? Alone in front of the mirror, he began to whisper with difficulty, "If you're listening." And he fell to his knees for the first time, not to show off, but as a man who had no more strength, no purpose, no desire to prove anything, just emptiness and weakness, hoping God would really listen. Marcus tried to return to the air, attempted to come back, tried to pretend everything was the same, but in the first minutes of the show, his voice failed completely. Live broadcast. The audience began to whisper. The operators exchanged glances. He tried to make a joke but couldn't say a word. In panic, he signaled to stop the camera. For the first time, the show was interrupted without warning. Backstage, the producers couldn't understand what was happening. He wrote on a piece of paper, "Lost my voice." They called doctors, speech therapists, neurologists. One of them, after examining Marcus, said, "No injuries, nothing serious, perhaps psychological." Marcus's eyes widened and he wanted to scream, "This isn't madness," but he couldn't even whisper. It was real horror, and it came from within. The news spread quickly. "Marcus Brennan loses his voice live on television," the headlines read. Some mocked him, others called it divine punishment. Old videos where he mocked faith resurfaced. Clips from the moment he challenged God went viral, and one name kept appearing on social media. God answered. Marcus locked himself at home for several days, tried to write, but it was all useless. His thoughts were confused. The silence around him seemed deafening. He turned on the TV and saw old recordings of his interviews, his smiles, jokes, mockery. Now it seemed like the actions belonged to a completely different person. For the first time, he looked at himself from the outside and felt shame. He barely slept, tormented by nightmares, always the same. An empty stage and him trying to speak, but an invisible hand prevented him from opening his mouth. He woke up in a cold sweat with his heart racing and throat burning. Until one night, walking through the dark apartment, he saw something strange in the window's reflection. For a second, he thought he saw someone standing behind him, but turning around, he saw no one. Frightened, he collapsed on the sofa, trembling. He grabbed his phone and wrote, "If anyone can hear me, I surrender." He pressed send, not knowing to whom, just a message into the void. He took his mother's Bible again, this time deliberately opening the Gospel and stopping at Mark 9:24. "I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." The next morning, he received an unexpected call. It was from a new Christian television program. They said, "We want to talk, not to argue, but to pray for you." Marcus almost hung up, but something inside him whispered, "Listen." He didn't respond, just cried for the first time, not from pain but from relief. Someone wanted to pray for him, and it was at that moment he realized he had fallen, but not into the abyss he feared so much, but precisely into that ground from which one can look up for the first time. 2 days passed. Marcus still hadn't answered the call from the Christian program, but he couldn't get that woman's voice out of his head. "We don't want to argue. We want to pray." Those words were like a seed thrown on the rock of his pride. He walked around the house like a ghost. The silence that had once served as his shield had now become a mirror. Everything he had hidden behind a facade of glory was now right before his eyes. On Sunday morning, something strange happened. When he woke up, he found a handwritten note under the door in confident handwriting. Today, at 6 p.m., at St. Luke's Chapel. No cameras, no subtitles, no logos. He immediately realized it was for him. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was someone's joke. But at 5:40 p.m., he was already sitting in his car in front of a small chapel in the old part of the city. The chapel was modest. Wooden ceiling, wooden benches, stained glass windows with twilight. Inside there was no music, no sermon, no spectators. Just one man kneeling at the altar, his back to the entrance, and there was barely a hint of incense smell. Marcus walked halfway down the aisle and stopped. The man stood up, turned, and looked calmly at him. He had a serene face, deep eyes, and wore simple clothes, jeans, a white shirt, and a small crucifix around his neck. "You're here," he said, as if he already knew. Marcus tried to respond, but only nodded. The man continued, "You still don't understand? This isn't punishment. It's a calling." Marcus felt cold. He wanted to ask who this man was, but couldn't. He sat on the front bench and the man beside him. Minutes passed in complete silence. "You lost your voice because you used it for yourself," he said. "But when it returns, it won't be yours anymore." Marcus lowered his head. His heart was racing. He wanted to get up and run, but he couldn't. Something prevented him, not by force, but by purpose. "Your mother always prayed for you. She asked God not to let you die that way," the man continued, and a slight moisture appeared in his eyes. Marcus's eyes widened. How did he know about his mother? About her prayers? He couldn't pronounce a word, only tears. For the first time he cried not for himself, but for everything he had hurt and despised, ignored. The man extended his hand and took Marcus's. "You still have time," he said. "Time to change, time to give back, time to recover what didn't belong to you." Marcus closed his eyes. There was no music, no visible miracle, but there was something that couldn't be explained through a program, not through arguments, not through words. Peace. When he opened his eyes, the man was already standing at the altar. He turned one last time. "You were called because you were heard. Now let them hear you again, but this time, let them hear the truth." And he left through the side door. Marcus remained seated, as if he had seen the world turn upside down and finally stand firm in place. That night, returning home, he sat on the floor of his room and wrote on a piece of paper, "If my voice returns, it will be yours." He folded the sheet, placed it in the Bible, and fell asleep like a child, for the first time in long weeks, in peace. In the morning, Marcus woke up with tranquility. The air seemed different. The room, previously heavy and stuffy, seemed to breathe with him. He got up slowly, took the note he had written the day before, and reread it. "If my voice returns, it will be yours." He closed his eyes and for the first time said silently, hoarsely, almost in a whisper, but he said it, "Thank you." The voice responded, not with strength but with humility. He didn't shout, he didn't celebrate. He just smiled quietly, like someone who understood he hadn't won. He had been defeated. A new silence arose within him. The tongue that once mocked now longed to bless. What had jeered now wanted to ask for forgiveness. It seemed like a quiet stream began to leak where before there was dry, dead sand. Marcus didn't tell anyone what had happened in the chapel. Not about the man with the deep gaze whom he didn't want to touch. It was something too personal, too sacred. He called the Christian television program that had contacted him before. With a trembling voice, he simply said, "I want to go, but not for an interview. I want to listen." There was silence on the other end of the line, then tears. When he arrived for the recording, everyone was surprised. He was different. The same look, the same features, but a different glow. Less pride, more humility. The inspiring woman, simple and serene, hugged him. Marcus sat in the studio, not to give orders, but to become a boy again. The spotlights turned on, the cameras began to record, and he just listened. They told stories of faith, testimonies from ordinary people, healing, transformation, forgiveness. Marcus listened to everything as if hearing the world for the first time. Not to argue, but to absorb. Each word resonated in his heart, healing wounds he didn't even know he had. At one point, the host looked into his eyes and asked, "Do you want to say something?" He took a deep breath. The studio was filled with silence. Then, with a firm but calm voice, he responded, "For many years I used my voice for mockery. Today, if I can still speak, it means God wanted to reach me, and he did." There was no applause, no background music, just silence filled with presence. After the recording, no one really spoke. Everyone seemed to understand that something important had happened. Marcus left the studio slowly, with light steps. On the street, a man waved and said, "Thank you for coming back." He smiled but knew he had returned for others. That night, before going to bed, he did something he hadn't done since childhood. He knelt, not to beg, but to thank. And in that silence, the same one he had feared so much, he felt he was no longer alone. The voice that had silenced him now propelled him forward. After participating in the Christian program, Marcus disappeared from the media. He refused interviews, offers, and contracts. Some said he was crazy, others that he was canceled, but those who knew him well saw he was changing from within. For the first time, he was no longer moved by the sound of his own voice, but by words he had previously rejected. He spent weeks in voluntary silence, visiting the places where his most provocative episodes had occurred. In each one, he sat for a few minutes, closed his eyes, and remembered what he said. Attacks, laughter, public humiliation disguised as humor. He realized how much pain he left in hearts he might never see again, but perhaps now he could reach them in a different way. He returned to his mother's house. She was still in the hospital but breathing more calmly. He sat beside her, held her hand, and prayed aloud for the first time, ugly but sincere. "Lord, I laughed at something I didn't understand, but now I ask only one thing. Take care of her as she always prayed for me." The nurse caring for his mother smiled upon hearing this. A calm young woman with a soft voice said, "She still hears you. The Spirit knows when love speaks." Marcus thanked her with tears in his eyes and began visiting other patients in the hospital, not to heal, not to preach, but to listen. He sat down, asked names, heard stories, and said, "You're not alone." An elderly woman recognized him. "Aren't you the TV host who spoke badly about the Bible?" she asked ironically. Marcus smiled and with sincere humility responded, "Yes, that's me, but the Bible spoke to me, and now I'm listening." She squeezed his hand tightly. "Then it wasn't all in vain. You have no idea how many people were praying for you." That phrase impacted him. How many people prayed for him while he laughed at them? How many secret petitions supported him when he considered himself strong enough to sustain himself alone? With each step of his journey, Marcus remembered the faces of the past, pastors, elderly people, even children who before looked at him with compassion, not anger. And now he understood why. He attended a small meeting in a simple community, sat in the very back without revealing who he was. The young preacher said with passion, "Don't mock God, but if you do, know that he still calls you by name." Marcus burst into tears. The phrase hit him like a sword. It seemed heaven itself was responding to him personally. After the meeting, the young preacher approached and said, "You know, one day I saw your videos and prayed for you. I asked God to do the impossible, to make you his instrument. I was just a teenager at that moment, but God listened." Marcus hugged him, unable to speak. For the first time, he felt the weight of grace, of being reached by voices he once rejected, but that God had always heard. That night, Marcus wrote, "The voices I ignored were the ones that saved me," and he realized, it's time to start over, not as a star, but as a servant. Marcus began to write, not to publish, not for the love that had arrived, but to remember. He started a simple notebook in which he wrote down the names of all the people who influenced his life from the moment of change. There he noted names, dates, phrases he heard, places where he cried, and especially prayers. Each line like a seed, each page a reminder that God had restored in him what fame had destroyed. One rainy day, walking through the streets of downtown Chicago, he saw a Christian bookstore. He entered without thinking and began leafing through books as if he knew what he was looking for. At the back of the room, he noticed a poster, "Wilderness Voices Bible Study, every Wednesday at 7 p.m. He chuckled. "Wilderness Voices sound like me," he thought, and wrote down the address. That Wednesday he arrived early. The room was small, for a maximum of 20 people. He sat in a corner. A simple man began speaking about Moses. He said, God needed 40 years of silence to prepare Moses for the liberation of the people. Marcus lowered his head, eyes full of tears. Silence. There it was again. But now he didn't see it as punishment, but as preparation. After the meeting, the host approached him. You know, while I was speaking, I felt I needed to tell you this. Don't be ashamed of your fall. It was necessary for you to understand where the true voice came from. Marcus thanked him and returned home with deep inner peace. It seemed that with each step, light penetrated the innermost chambers of his soul, previously dark and locked. A week later, he received an invitation to speak at an event for addicts in recovery, not as a celebrity, but as a man who knows darkness. He hesitated but went, and looking into the eyes of dozens of men destroyed by life, he said, I just lost my voice to understand the value of listening. If you're silent now, know that God hears that silence. The reaction was profound. Men cried, prayed, confessed, not because he was eloquent, but because now there was truth in his words. It seemed that God, having destroyed Marcus's old structure, now used its fragments to touch other wounded people, and this was inexplicably powerful. Returning to the hospital, he saw that his mother had woken up, weak but conscious. She looked at him and whispered, Did you come back? He squeezed her hand and responded, He really brought me back. She smiled. It was the most beautiful smile he had ever seen, and then he realized the miracle wasn't just that his voice returned, but that it began to speak with new meaning. That night, he opened the Bible and found an old note. If my voice returns, it will be yours. He smiled, glued the note to the first page, and signed at the bottom. It returned, and now there's no more silence because when light enters the heart, even silence begins to shine. Marcus understood that sooner or later he would have to appear again before the cameras, not for fame, but because now his voice had a new purpose. He accepted an invitation from a small Christian channel without viewers and without a script. The idea was simple: tell what happened, not as sensationalism, but as proof. The studio was modest: a sofa, a camera, soft lighting. He sat down and took a deep breath. The recording began. The interviewer was reserved and respectful. Marcus, many people remember you from when you mocked faith. What happened to you? Silence followed. He smiled slightly and responded, I lost everything I thought I was to discover who I really am, and began to tell without embellishment, without shame, just the truth. He told about the fall, about losing his voice, about the silent chapel, about the man with the deep gaze, about the note, about his mother's prayer, about voices he didn't listen to, and how in the end it was God who used silence to heal him. With each phrase, the atmosphere in the studio became denser, filled with something invisible but real. Even the operator, who initially looked at the clock, now cried silently. Marcus held his mother's Bible in his hands, showed the note glued to the first page, and read it aloud. If my voice returns, it will be yours. Then he looked directly at the camera and continued, and now I don't use it to insult. I use it to strengthen, to say that there is a God who loves you even when you insult him. He doesn't take offense like people do. He keeps calling. The interview wasn't long, wasn't spectacular, but it was real. And when truth is lived, it touches. A few days later, the video went on air. At first, it didn't have many views, but someone shared it, then someone else, and soon a wave of comments began to emerge. I remember that person. This is a completely different Marcus. If God managed to reach him, he can reach me. This testimony saved me today. The video went viral, not with a thunderous explosion, but like a flame in dry grass, silent and irreversible. Marcus didn't seek fame, but it came to him again. Only now he used it as a pulpit. For each invitation to debates, he refused. He only accepted meetings. Instead of discussions, hugs. Instead of provocations, prayers. One day during filming, a sound engineer approached him and said, I was there that day when you tore up the Bible live on television. Marcus froze. The man continued, and that same day I prayed for you. Today, seeing this, I understand that God really listens. Marcus hugged him. There was nothing more to say. That night, Marcus wrote, The scene I ridiculed, now I use to heal. And then he realized the interview wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, because when God transforms a voice, It never sounds alone again. Months passed. Marcus was no longer the man who disturbed the corridors. Now he sat in small groups, prayer circles, and read psalms aloud in nursing homes and prisons. His name still caused surprise. "Is it you?" some asked, and he simply responded with a smile. Yes, or more precisely, it was. The silence that followed that response spoke louder than 1,000 sermons. He received letters from all over the country. People who had abandoned faith after hearing his story decided to try again. Young people who previously followed him because of sarcasm now listened to him in search of hope. Atheists who left the church, even wounded religious people, all found something special in his new voice. Not authority, but reconciliation. He was invited to the Center for Young Offenders, boys aged 13 to 17 who ended up there because of crime, violence, family abandonment. The director said, "They don't listen, but maybe they'll hear you." Marcus entered the room and saw cold, skeptical looks. He began to speak not from a position of authority, but from understanding. "I also didn't hear the right voices until I lost mine." He told his story simply, without moralisms, without judgments, and at the end, after a few seconds of silence, one of the teenagers raised his hand. "Why did God listen to you? You were speaking badly about him." Marcus responded calmly, "Because he listens even when we scream against him, and loves even when we turn away. That's not injustice, that's grace." That phrase offended everyone. One of the boys began to cry. Another stood up and asked for a Bible. The social worker sitting in the corner recorded what was happening, moved, and Marcus realized that now doors didn't open for him because of his former glory, but because of the story God wrote about his fall. His pain now healed others. One night, walking alone in Lincoln Park, he heard a street preacher reading Isaiah 6:8. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Marcus stopped and sat on the nearest bench and whispered, "Here I am. Send me." Not to be a hero, but to be an echo of that voice that silenced him to teach him to listen. In his house, now modestly renovated, he created a wall with photographs, faces of people he met after his transformation. Each face a reminder that redemption isn't proclaimed loudly. It's lived and transmitted with truth, with tears, with voice, and with silence. He received an anonymous message on his phone, just one phrase. "Thank you for using your voice. I'm one of those who prayed for you when no one else believed." He didn't respond. He just closed his eyes, smiled, and said, "How good that God listens even to what we never dare to say," because now his voice wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who once doubted but returned, because finally someone heard them. It was an ordinary Sunday morning when Marcus received the most unexpected invitation to preach at the very church he once mocked on national television. The pastor wrote, "The same one who wounded can now heal. We want to hear that new voice God raised up." Marcus froze for a few minutes, looking at the phone screen. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a redemptive message. That Sunday, the church was packed. People stood, sat on the floor. Many remembered him, his videos, cruel jokes, interviews, but now they waited for something different. Marcus entered through the central doors. There were no spotlights, just looks. Looks that saw a new person and hearts ready to welcome him. He walked to the pulpit slowly, placed his mother's Bible on the stand, and looked at the congregation. He saw faces that once he would have mocked, and now he saw brothers and sisters. He took a deep breath and began to speak, not with the voice of the old Marcus Brennan, the arrogant television host, but with the voice of a man who had been broken, silenced, and rebuilt by grace. "I stand before you today not as someone who has arrived, but as someone who fell and was lifted up," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I mocked what I didn't understand. I challenged what I feared. I used my voice as a weapon when it was meant to be a gift." He paused, looking down at the Bible. "My mother prayed for me for years. She prayed when I didn't deserve it, when I spat on everything she believed in. And God heard her, not because I was worthy, but because His love doesn't wait for us to deserve it." The congregation sat in profound silence. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Marcus continued, sharing his story of pride and fall, of silence and surrender, of the mysterious man in the chapel and the note he had written. He spoke of hospitals and prison visits, of young offenders and elderly patients, of every face that had shown him what true faith looked like. I learned that silence isn't the absence of God, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Sometimes silence is God's loudest call. He took my voice to give me ears. He broke my pride to give me purpose. When he finished, there was no applause, no triumphant music, just a holy silence that felt like the presence of something greater than any of them. People began to stand, not to leave, but to pray. Some approached Marcus not to congratulate him, but to embrace him, to tell him they had prayed for him, that they had never stopped believing God could reach even the hardest heart. An elderly man with trembling hands took Marcus's face in his palms and said, "Welcome home, son. We've been waiting for you." That night, Marcus sat alone in his small apartment in downtown Chicago, the city lights glimmering through his window. He opened his mother's Bible to the note he had written months ago. "If my voice returns, it will be yours." Below it, he wrote something new. "It returned, and now I understand. The voice was never mine to begin with. Everything is yours, Lord. Everything has always been yours." He closed the Bible gently, placed it on his chest, and for the first time in his entire life, Marcus Brennan felt complete. Not because he had found his voice again, but because he had finally learned to listen. The silence that once terrified him now comforted him, for in that silence he heard the voice of the one who had never stopped calling his name, even when he was too proud to answer. In the months that followed, Marcus's life took on a rhythm he never could have imagined in his years of television fame. He started a small ministry called Voices from the Wilderness, a reference to the Bible study group that had impacted him so deeply. It wasn't flashy or grand, just a simple outreach to those who felt voiceless, the forgotten, the broken, the mocked. He visited homeless shelters in Boston, spoke at recovery centers in Detroit, sat with families in Philadelphia who had lost loved ones to violence. Everywhere he went, he carried the same message, that God's grace reaches into the deepest darkness, that no one is too far gone, that silence can be a gift if we learn to listen in it. His mother recovered slowly, a process the doctors called miraculous. When she was finally strong enough to leave the hospital, Marcus was there every day, reading scripture to her, praying with her, thanking her for never giving up on him. "I knew God would reach you," she whispered one afternoon, her frail hand in his. "I just didn't know how much it would cost you." Marcus smiled through tears. "It cost me everything, Mom, and it was worth every moment." She squeezed his hand and closed her eyes peacefully, a smile on her weathered face. The old television network that had once employed Marcus reached out multiple times, offering him a new show, a comeback special, a chance to reclaim his spotlight. Each time, Marcus politely declined. "That stage doesn't belong to me anymore," he told his former producer. "I found a better audience, one that doesn't measure success by ratings but by transformed hearts." The producer didn't understand, but Marcus didn't need him to. Some things could only be understood by those who had walked through the valley themselves. One evening, as Marcus prepared for a small gathering at a community center in Queens, New York, he received a message from an unknown number. It was brief. "I was the cameraman who filmed you the day you tore up the Bible. I quit that job the next week because I couldn't be part of destroying faith. But I want you to know I prayed for you every single day since then. Seeing what you've become, I know God is real. Thank you for letting him use you." Marcus read the message 3 times, his eyes blurring with tears. He saved it and added the unnamed cameraman to his prayer list, another invisible thread in the tapestry of grace that had woven his redemption. At the gathering that night, a young woman approached him nervously. She couldn't have been more than 19, with tired eyes and a trembling voice. "Mr. Brennan," she began, "I saw your video, the one where you talked about losing your voice. I've been thinking about ending my life for weeks now, but something in your story made me think maybe God hasn't given up on me either." Marcus felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. He sat with her for over an hour, not preaching, not lecturing, just listening as she poured out years of pain, abuse, and hopelessness. When she finally finished, he simply said, "You're here. That means you're meant to be here. And if God can use someone like me, someone who mocked him on national television, imagine what he can do with a heart as honest as yours." They prayed together, and when she left, she looked different, lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted. Marcus watched her go and felt the familiar ache of gratitude mixed with unworthiness. How many times had God taken his brokenness and used it to heal someone else? How many times had his worst moments become someone's rescue? It was a mystery he would never fully understand, but he no longer needed to. Faith, he had learned, wasn't about understanding everything. It was about trusting the one who did. Years passed, quiet and purposeful. Marcus never returned to the spotlight, never sought the fame that had once defined him. He lived simply, spoke humbly, and loved deeply. His hair grayed, his face lined with the marks of genuine joy and hard-won peace. He married a woman he met at a church in Portland, a gentle soul who had her own story of redemption, and together they fostered children who had been abandoned or abused, giving them the kind of home Marcus wished he'd had as a child. On the 10th anniversary of the day he lost his voice, Marcus sat in the same chapel where the mysterious man with deep eyes had spoken to him. He never saw that man again, never learned his name, but he had never forgotten his words. This isn't punishment, it's a calling. Marcus knelt at the same altar, in the same spot where he had surrendered a decade ago, and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. Thank you for silencing me, Lord. Thank you for loving me enough to break me. Thank you for every person who prayed when I didn't deserve it. And thank you for showing me that the greatest voice isn't the loudest one, but the one that speaks your truth in love. As he prayed, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. I know you, she said softly. I was at that Bible study 10 years ago, the night you first came. I'm Margaret. Marcus stood and embraced her gently. I remember, he said. You were sitting in the front row. She nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. I prayed for you that night and every night since. My grandson saw your old videos and lost his faith because of them. He said if someone like you could mock God and nothing happened, then God must not be real. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his past settle on his shoulders, but it was different now, not crushing but clarifying. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Margaret shook her head firmly. Don't be sorry, be grateful. Because 2 months ago my grandson saw your testimony video. He watched you tell your story, and he wept like a baby. He called me that night and said, Grandma, if God can change Marcus Brennan, maybe he's real after all. Maybe he can change me too. He gave his life to Christ last Sunday. Marcus couldn't speak. He simply held the old woman as they both cried tears of joy and redemption. This was the mystery of grace, he realized. God didn't just redeem his future, he redeemed his past, taking even his worst moments and weaving them into something beautiful. The sins that once destroyed now testified to the power of transformation. The voice that once mocked now proclaimed mercy, and the man who once stood proud now knelt humble, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Over the following years, Marcus's ministry grew quietly but powerfully. He never advertised, never sought funding, never built a platform. Instead, he simply went where he was called, spoke when he was asked, and listened always. He developed a particular burden for those in media, journalists and entertainers who felt trapped by their public personas, unable to show weakness or doubt. He started a confidential support group in Manhattan for people in the entertainment industry struggling with faith, addiction, or identity. They met in a basement of an old church on Thursday nights, and no cameras were ever allowed. One Thursday evening, a famous late-night comedian showed up, someone Marcus had once considered a peer in the art of mockery. The man sat in the back, hood pulled up, sunglasses on even in the dim light. He said nothing for the first 3 meetings, just listened as others shared their stories of brokenness and redemption. On the 4th week, as the meeting was ending, the comedian approached Marcus. I'm next, he said quietly. I can feel it. I'm doing exactly what you did, and I can feel something coming. Marcus looked at him with compassion, not judgment. Then you have a choice I didn't have. You know what's ahead. You can surrender now, or you can wait for him to bring you to your knees. The comedian's face crumpled. I don't know how to stop. The jokes, the ratings, the approval, it's like a drug. I don't know who I am without it. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. I know exactly what you mean, but I also know that who you are without it is who you've always been underneath, just buried under layers of performance and pride. And that person is worth finding, I promise you. They prayed together that night, and Marcus gave the comedian his personal number. Call me any time, day or night. You don't have to walk this path alone. 3 months later, the comedian made headlines by walking away from his show at the height of its popularity. The media called it a breakdown, a scandal, a mystery. But Marcus received a text that simply said, "I jumped before I was pushed. Pray for me." And Marcus did, faithfully, adding another name to the growing list of souls he carried before the throne of grace. His mother lived to see her 85th birthday, surrounded by family in the small house where she had prayed for Marcus all those years. On her final day, Marcus sat beside her bed, holding her hand as her breathing grew shallow and peaceful. "You did it, Mom," he whispered. "Your prayers saved me." She smiled weakly and shook her head. "Not my prayers, son. His grace. I just asked, and he answered in his time, in his way, always in his way." Those were her last words, and Marcus held her hand as she slipped peacefully into eternity, her face radiant even in death. At her funeral, Marcus stood before a packed church and shared his mother's story, not his own. He told of her faithfulness through poverty and abandonment, her unwavering belief when her son publicly mocked everything she held sacred, her quiet prayers in hospital beds and lonely nights. "She never gave up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I gave her every reason to walk away, she stayed on her knees. And that's the power of a praying mother, the power of faithful intercession. My mother's prayers didn't change God's mind about me. They aligned her heart with His will, and together they outlasted my rebellion." After the service, dozens of people approached Marcus with their own stories of praying mothers, faithful fathers, persistent friends who had never stopped believing. Each story was a thread in the larger tapestry, a reminder that redemption was rarely a solo journey. We are saved by grace through faith, yes, but we are often carried to that point by the prayers of those who loved us before we loved ourselves. As Marcus entered his 60s, his pace slowed, but his purpose never wavered. He wrote a book, not about himself, but about the power of redemptive silence, about what God can do in the quiet spaces when we stop performing and start listening. The book was published by a small Christian press and never made any bestseller lists, but the letters he received from readers told him everything he needed to know. People were being set free, not by his eloquence but by his honesty, not by his triumph, but by his transparency about the cost of pride and the gift of brokenness. He continued to visit prisons, though his steps were slower now, and he needed a cane after a minor stroke. In a maximum security facility in upstate New York, he sat with a man on death row, a murderer who had taken 3 lives in a robbery gone wrong. The man had been hardened by years of violence and incarceration, his heart encased in layers of bitterness and rage. But as Marcus shared his story, something cracked in the prisoner's face. "You really think God could forgive someone like me?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus leaned forward, his aged eyes clear and certain. "I don't think it, I know it. Because if He can forgive me for leading thousands away from Him, mocking His word on national television, and living in arrogant rebellion for decades, then yes, He can forgive you. The question isn't whether He can. The question is whether you'll let Him." That day, in a concrete cell with bars on the windows and guards outside the door, a murderer bowed his head and asked Jesus Christ to save him. Marcus wept with him. 2 broken men clinging to the same cross, both equally in need of grace. The years continued to pass, each one quieter than the last, but no less purposeful. Marcus lived to see some of the young people he had mentored become pastors, counselors, and servants in their own right. He watched marriages restored, addictions broken, and prodigals return home. He never took credit for any of it, always deflecting to the one who had silenced him to give him a message worth speaking. On a cool October evening, Marcus sat in his small study, surrounded by journals filled with names and prayers, photographs of faces he'd encountered, letters from people whose lives had been touched by his testimony. His wife brought him tea and kissed the top of his silver head. "You should rest, love," she said gently. He smiled up at her. "I will, soon. I just want to finish this prayer." She left him there, and he bowed his head over his worn Bible, the same one his mother had carried, the same one he had once mocked. "Father," he prayed, his voice still strong despite his years, "thank you for every moment of silence, every tear of repentance, every step of this journey. Thank you for using a broken vessel, for taking my rubble and building something beautiful. Thank you for my mother's prayers, for the mysterious man in the chapel, for every person who interceded when I didn't deserve it. And Lord, if there's anyone out there right now, sitting in their pride, mocking you, challenging you, thinking they're untouchable, I pray you'll do for them what you did for me. Silence them with love, break them with mercy, and rebuild them for your glory. Because the greatest gift you ever gave me wasn't my voice back. It was learning to hear yours. He sat back in his chair, a deep peace settling over him. The city lights of Chicago twinkled outside his window, millions of souls going about their lives, each one known and loved by the God who had pursued one arrogant television host into silence and then into redemption. Marcus closed his eyes, not in sleep but in worship, and in the quietness of that moment, he heard it again. The voice that had called him from the chapel, from the darkness, from himself. Well done, good and faithful servant. Marcus smiled. After all these years, after all the miles and tears and prayers and transformed lives, those were the only words that mattered. Not the applause of crowds, not the ratings of shows, not the fame or influence or power he had once craved. Just those simple words from the one whose opinion was the only one that would last beyond the grave. He had been silenced to learn to listen. He had been broken to be rebuilt. He had lost everything to gain what truly mattered. And now, in the golden years of a life redeemed, Marcus Brennan understood what his mother had known all along. That God's love pursues relentlessly, that grace transforms completely, and that no one, absolutely no one, is beyond the reach of a God who speaks in silence and shouts in mercy. The voice that had once mocked now whispered worship. The tongue that had torn scripture now taught it tenderly. And the man who had challenged God to silence him had discovered that in that silence, he had finally found his truest voice, the one that would echo not just through the remainder of his days on earth, but throughout eternity. Years later, long after Marcus had gone to be with the Lord he once mocked and came to love, his story continued to ripple outward. The small book he had written was discovered by a young atheist blogger who bought it as a joke, intending to mock it online. But as she read late one night in her apartment in Seattle, something shifted. The authenticity of Marcus's journey, the raw honesty of his confession, the undeniable transformation, it all pointed to something she couldn't dismiss with sarcasm or reason away with logic. She found herself on her knees at 3 a.m, a position she had never been in before, and whispered into the darkness, "If you're real, if you really changed Marcus Brennan, then show me." And in the silence that followed, she felt something she had never experienced, a presence, warm and overwhelming, and utterly unlike anything her materialist worldview had room for. She wept, not knowing why, and in those tears began her own journey from mockery to faith, from pride to surrender. This pattern repeated across years and continents. A podcaster in London, a television producer in Mumbai, a radio host in Sydney, each one encountered Marcus's story in different ways, and each one found themselves confronted with the same question. If God can transform someone that far gone, what does that mean for me? The ripples continued, impossible to trace, impossible to measure, but real nonetheless. In that same chapel where Marcus had first surrendered, where the mysterious man with deep eyes had spoken words that changed everything, a plaque was installed. It read simply, "In this place, Marcus Brennan learned that God's silence is sometimes his loudest call. May all who enter here find the courage to listen." Beneath it was a quote from Marcus himself, taken from his journal. "I thought losing my voice was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. The worst thing would have been never learning to listen." The chapel became a quiet pilgrimage site for those struggling with pride, with doubt, with the weight of past mistakes. People would sit in the same pew where Marcus sat, kneel at the same altar where he surrendered, and in the sacred silence of that space many heard the same call he had heard. "Return, be still, listen, and let me rebuild you." Marcus's wife, in her final years, established a scholarship fund for young people entering ministry, who had backgrounds in media or entertainment. She knew her husband's heart, knew he would want to see others use their platforms for redemption rather than destruction. The first recipient was the grandson of Margaret, the woman who had prayed faithfully for 10 years. He became a youth pastor in Brooklyn, using spoken word poetry and digital media to reach young people, telling them the story of a man named Marcus Brennan, who mocked God and lived to worship him. The testimony continued, passed down through generations, adapted to new technologies and cultures, but always carrying the same core truth, that pride leads to destruction, but God's grace leads to restoration, that silence can be a gift, that it's never too late to surrender, that the voice we think we need is often the very thing standing between us and what we actually need. In heaven, if we could glimpse it, we might see Marcus reunited with his mother, both of them whole and radiant, watching as the prayers she prayed decades ago continue to bear fruit in lives they never met. We might see them rejoicing over every soul that found God through the testimony of a silenced tongue made new. We might hear them singing praises with voices that never tire, never fail, never speak anything but truth and love. But on earth, the story remains, a testament carved not in stone but in transformed lives. It whispers to the arrogant that humility is not defeat but victory. It shouts to the despairing that redemption is always possible. It proves to the skeptical that God is not threatened by our mockery but moved by our surrender. And it reminds us all that the greatest miracles are not the supernatural events we can see, but the transformed hearts we become. Marcus Brennan's voice was silenced so that God's voice could be heard. His pride was shattered so that grace could be revealed. His story ended so that countless other stories could begin. And in that divine exchange, in that beautiful collision of judgment and mercy, of justice and love, we see the gospel itself, that God takes the worst of us and makes it the best of him, that he wastes nothing, redeems everything, and never, ever stops calling his children home. The voice that was silenced became the voice that sang the loudest, not in volume but in impact, not in fame but in faithfulness. And somewhere, in living rooms and prison cells, in chapels and coffee shops, in moments of quiet desperation and loud rebellion, people still hear that story and wonder, if Marcus Brennan can be changed, can I? The answer, resounding through decades and echoing into eternity, is always the same. Yes, by the grace of God, yes.